The moment I saw the boy in the garden, I knew my past had not stayed buried. He stood among the roses with his back to me, his small hands reaching for a butterfly, and when he turned, I saw my own eyes staring back at me from a face I had only held once, 5 years ago, before I surrendered him to save us both. I remember the exact weight of him in my arms. I remember the way his tiny fingers curled around mine in the cold hours before dawn, when I walked 3 miles through November rain to the cottage where Margaret and Thomas Byrne had agreed to take him. I was 19 years old. I had no money, no family willing to claim me, and no future that did not lead to ruin. Charles Whitmore had made certain of that when he looked at me with those pale blue eyes and told me that a woman of my station could never be his wife, regardless of the child she carried. I had loved him with the reckless abandon of youth. He was a viscount's son, charming and attentive, and when he whispered promises in the shadows of my uncle's garden, I believed every word. I believed that love could transcend the boundaries of birth and fortune. I believed that the passion we shared would bind him to me forever. I was a fool dressed in borrowed hope, and Charles Whitmore was the architect of my destruction. When I told him about the child, his expression changed so completely that I wondered if I had ever known him at all. The warmth vanished from his face like sunlight retreating behind storm clouds. He informed me, with the calm detachment of a man discussing an inconvenient debt, that our association had reached its natural conclusion. He had an understanding with Lady Sophia Pennington, an heiress whose fortune would restore his family's dwindling estates. A bastard child and its disgraced mother had no place in his carefully constructed future. I begged, God help me. I begged him on my knees in that very garden where he had once sworn to love me until his dying breath. He stepped away from me as though my desperation were contagious, adjusted his coat, and walked back toward the house without a single glance over his shoulder. That was the last time I saw Charles Whitmore for 5 years. My uncle discovered my condition 2 months later. He was a stern man, my mother's elder brother, who had taken me in after my parents died of fever when I was 14. He had never shown me affection, but he had provided me with shelter and a modest education, and I had repaid his grudging charity with scandal. When I could no longer hide the evidence of my shame beneath loosened corsets and strategic shawls, he summoned me to his study and delivered his verdict. I would leave his house before the week was out. He would provide me with enough money to survive until the child was born, but nothing more. His reputation in the community could not withstand the stain of an unwed mother beneath his roof. I found lodging in a boarding house on the outskirts of a village 30 miles from everything I had known. The woman who ran it asked no questions, and I offered no explanations. I spent the remaining months of my pregnancy in solitude, watching winter descend upon the countryside through a window that would not close properly, feeling my child move within me, and wondering what kind of life I could possibly give him. The birth was difficult. I labored for nearly 2 days with only a midwife and the boarding house keeper to attend me. When my son finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, I looked at him and felt something crack open inside my chest. He was perfect. He was mine. And I knew, with the clarity that only desperation can provide, that I could not keep him. I had no means of support. No respectable household would employ an unwed mother, and the alternatives available to women in my position were too terrible to contemplate. If I kept my son, we would both descend into poverty and degradation. He would grow up marked by the circumstances of his birth, denied every opportunity, scorned by a society that punished children for the sins of their parents. But if I gave him to someone else, someone who could raise him without the shadow of scandal, he might have a chance at a decent life. Margaret Byrne was the midwife's sister. She and her husband Thomas had been married for 8 years without children of their own, a sorrow that had aged them both beyond their years. When I approached her with my proposition, she wept. She promised me that she would love my son as though he had come from her own body, that she would give him everything within her modest power to give. I believed her because I needed to believe her, because the alternative was a darkness I could not face. I named him William before I handed him over. William, after my father, who had been a good man and who would have loved his grandson regardless of the circumstances. I held my son for 1 hour in the gray light of a November morning, memorizing the curve of his cheek and the surprising strength of his grip, and then I wrapped him in the only fine thing I owned, a shawl that had belonged to my mother, and I walked through the rain to the burned cottage, and I gave him away. The years that followed are difficult to speak of, even now. I transformed myself through sheer force of will. I found employment as a lady's maid with a family who did not ask about my past, and I learned everything I could about managing a household, about the intricacies of etiquette and deportment, about the 100 small skills that separated a servant from a governess. I was determined to rise. I was determined to become someone who could provide for her son, someone who could eventually reclaim him and give him the life he deserved. By the time I was 22, I had secured a position as a governess with a respectable family in Yorkshire. I was good at my work. I was patient with children, competent in the subjects I taught, and invisible in the way that employers prefer their servants to be. I saved every penny I could spare, dreaming of the day when I would have enough to rent a small cottage and bring William home. I visited him when I could, which was not nearly often enough. The Burns had moved twice in the years since I had given him to them, always seeking better opportunities, always struggling against the limitations of their circumstances. Thomas worked as a farmhand, and Margaret took in sewing, and together they provided William with a home that was poor but loving. He grew into a beautiful child with my green eyes and a serious expression that reminded me of my father. He called Margaret mother, and each time I heard it, something inside me died a little more. I never told him the truth. I visited as a friend of the family, a kind lady who brought small gifts and told stories and always had to leave too soon. I watched him grow from a distance, and I told myself that I was protecting him, that the truth would only cause him pain. I told myself a great many things in those years, and most of them were lies I needed to survive. Everything changed 6 months ago. I received a letter from Margaret, written in a shaking hand that spoke of illness and fear. Thomas had died the previous winter, taken by a fever that had swept through the village, and Margaret herself had been diagnosed with consumption. She did not have long to live, and she did not know what would become of William when she was gone. I left Yorkshire within the week. I had saved enough money to support myself for perhaps 3 months, but beyond that, I had no plan. I knew only that I could not let my son become a ward of the parish, could not let him disappear into the workhouses that swallowed children like him and rarely released them whole. I arrived at Margaret's cottage to find her bedridden and William tending to her with a solemnity that no 5-year-old child should possess. She died 2 weeks later. I held her hand at the end, and I thanked her for loving my son when I could not, and I promised her that I would find a way to give him the life she had wanted for him. She smiled at me with the peace of the dying, and then she was gone, and William and I were alone in a world that had no place for either of us. I did not know what to do. I could not take William with me to seek employment. No respectable household would hire a governess who appeared with a child in tow, regardless of the explanation offered. But I could not leave him either. I had already abandoned him once, and the thought of doing so again was more than I could bear. It was then that I heard about the Duke of Ashworth. Edmund Blackwood was a name spoken in whispers in the servants' quarters of every great house in England. He was immensely wealthy, famously reclusive, and shrouded in tragedy. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, and the infant had not survived her. Since then, the Duke had retreated from society entirely, confining himself to his estate in the countryside and refusing all visitors. He was known to be difficult, demanding, and utterly indifferent to the conventions that governed his class. He was also, according to the rumors, seeking a governess. I applied for the position with little hope. I had no references that would satisfy a duke, no connections that could speak to my character. But something drove me forward, some instinct that I could not name, and I sent my letter and waited for a rejection that never came. Instead, I received a summons. The Duke wished to interview me in person at his estate, Ashworth Hall. I was to present myself within the fortnight. I left William with the village vicar's wife, a kind woman who agreed to look after him temporarily in exchange for the last of my savings. I promised him that I would return soon, that I would find a way to make everything right. He looked at me with those serious green eyes, and he did not cry, and somehow that was worse than if he had. The journey to Ashworth Hall took 2 days by coach. The estate was in a remote part of the country, far from the bustle of London and the prying eyes of society. As we approached, I caught my first glimpse of the house through the carriage window, and I understood immediately why the Duke had chosen to hide himself here. It was a fortress of grey stone, imposing and isolated, surrounded by gardens that had once been beautiful but now showed signs of neglect, the kind of place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. The butler who admitted me was an elderly man with a face that revealed nothing. He led me through halls lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, past rooms shrouded in dust cloths, to a study at the rear of the house where the Duke awaited me. Edmund Blackwood was not what I had expected. I had imagined a man broken by grief, diminished by loss. Instead, I found a figure of commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and eyes the color of winter storms. He was perhaps 35 years old, and he regarded me with an intensity that made me want to look away. I did not look away. He asked me questions for nearly an hour. He wanted to know about my education, my experience, my philosophy of child-rearing. He asked what books I had read and what languages I spoke, and whether I believed in corporal punishment. I answered as honestly as I dared, omitting only the parts of my history that would have disqualified me immediately. He listened without expression, his gray eyes never leaving my face, and when I had finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he asked me if I had any children of my own. The question caught me unprepared. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt my carefully constructed composure begin to crack. I could have lied. I should have lied. But something in his gaze, some quality of attention that went beyond mere curiosity, made me hesitate. And in that hesitation, I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. He told me that he would send word of his decision within the week. I left Ashworth Hall certain that I would never see it again, that my moment of weakness had cost me everything. 3 days later, a letter arrived. The Duke of Ashworth was pleased to offer me the position of governess. I was to begin immediately, and I was welcome to bring my son. I read those words a dozen times before I could believe them. I did not understand how he knew or why he was willing to overlook what should have been an insurmountable obstacle. I understood only that I had been given a chance I could not afford to question. I collected William from the vicar's wife and boarded a coach for Ashworth Hall. My son sat beside me, clutching the shawl that had once been my mother's, watching the countryside pass with wondering eyes. I held his hand and told him that we were going to a new home, that everything would be different now. I did not tell him that this home belonged to a duke or that I had no idea what awaited us within its walls. I did not tell him that I was terrified. We arrived at dusk. The butler admitted us with the same expressionless efficiency as before, and a housemaid led us to a suite of rooms on the 3rd floor. The rooms were clean and comfortable, far nicer than anywhere I had lived since leaving my uncle's house. There was a bedroom for me, a smaller room for William, and a schoolroom with books and maps, and a globe that spun on its axis. William's eyes went wide at the sight of it, and for the first time in weeks, I saw him smile. That night, after I had tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead and told him that I loved him, I stood at my window and looked out at the darkened gardens below. I did not know what the Duke of Ashworth wanted from me. I did not know why he had offered me this salvation when any other man in his position would have sent me away in disgrace. I knew only that I was grateful, and that I would do whatever was required to keep my son safe. I could not have known then that the Duke was keeping secrets of his own. I could not have known that within the walls of this house, my past and my future were about to collide in ways I had never imagined. I could not have known that the boy I had seen in the garden on my first day, the boy with green eyes and a butterfly cupped in his small hands, was not the child I was meant to teach. He was another child entirely. A child the Duke had rescued from a village in the north. A child whose mother had given him away 5 years ago on a cold November morning. My son was already here. He had been here all along. And the Duke of Ashworth, for reasons I could not begin to fathom, had been raising him as his own. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate for escape, while my mind raced through every possibility, every explanation, every reason why I might be wrong. Perhaps I had imagined the resemblance. Perhaps grief and exhaustion had conspired to show me what I longed to see. Perhaps there were simply 2 boys in the world with the same green eyes and the same serious expression, and fate had placed one of them in this house by pure coincidence. But I knew. In the deepest part of my soul, in the place where a mother's instinct lives beyond the reach of doubt, I knew that the child I had seen in the garden was my William, my son. The baby I had surrendered on that terrible November morning 5 years ago. The questions tormented me. How had he come to be here? What had happened to Margaret and Thomas Byrne? I had left William with them just weeks ago, had kissed his forehead and promised to return. Had something happened in the days since my departure? Had the Duke somehow discovered him and brought him here? And if so, why had he not told me? Why had he let me arrive with another child, a child he must have known was not the one already in his care? I rose before dawn and dressed in the darkness, my fingers fumbling with buttons and laces. I needed answers, and I knew only one person who could provide them. The Duke of Ashworth had brought me into his home, knowing more about my circumstances than I had revealed. He had offered me salvation while concealing a truth that changed everything. I intended to confront him, regardless of the consequences. The house was silent as I made my way through the corridors. The servants had not yet begun their morning duties, and the only sound was the soft echo of my footsteps on the polished floors. I found the Duke's study without difficulty, the same room where he had interviewed me just days before, and I knocked on the door with a determination that surprised me. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and still the room remained silent. I was about to turn away when I heard footsteps approaching from the opposite direction, and I turned to find the Duke himself emerging from the shadows of the hallway. He was dressed for riding, his boots still damp with morning dew, his dark hair disheveled by the wind. He stopped when he saw me, and something flickered across his face, an emotion I could not name, but which suggested he had been expecting this encounter. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. "You are awake early." I could not bring myself to exchange pleasantries. The words that had been building inside me all night demanded release, and I spoke them before I could lose my courage. "The boy in the garden," I said. "The one I saw yesterday when I arrived. Who is he?" The Duke studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes revealing nothing. Then he gestured toward the study door. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private." He led me into the room and closed the door behind us. The curtains were still drawn, and he moved to open them, flooding the space with the pale light of early morning. I watched his back as he stood at the window, broad shoulders held with military precision, and I waited for him to speak. "His name is William," the Duke said finally. He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I had not seen before, a vulnerability. A weariness that spoke of burdens carried alone for too long. He came to me 6 months ago, from a village in the north. A woman named Margaret Byrne had been caring for him, but she was dying of consumption and had no family to take him in. She reached out to me through a mutual acquaintance, asking if I might help find the boy a home. 6 months ago. The words struck me like a physical blow. Margaret had written to me about her illness, had begged me to come, but she had never mentioned that she had already made arrangements for William. She had never told me that she had given my son to a duke. I went to see them myself, the Duke continued. His voice had grown quieter, more contemplative. I do not know what I expected to find. A child like any other, I suppose, a problem to be solved with money and connections. But when I met William, when I looked into his eyes and saw the courage with which he faced his circumstances, something changed in me. He reminded me of someone I had lost. He paused, and I saw his jaw tighten with the effort of maintaining his composure. His wife, I realized. The child reminded him of his wife, or perhaps of the child they had lost together. I brought him here, the Duke said. I told my staff that he was a distant relation, an orphan I had agreed to raise. I gave him a home, an education, everything I could provide. But I knew that somewhere in the world there was a woman who had given birth to him. A woman who might still be searching for him. A woman who deserved to know that her son was safe. He looked at me then, and I understood. He had known who I was from the moment I applied for the position. He had known, and he had brought me here deliberately. How? I whispered. How did you find me? Margaret told me everything before she died, he replied. She wanted William to know the truth someday. She wanted him to know that his mother had not abandoned him out of cruelty, but out of love. She gave me your name, your last known address, and a shawl that she said belonged to your mother. When I saw your application, when I read your letter and recognized your name, I knew that fate had intervened in ways I could not ignore. I felt my legs grow weak beneath me, and I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself. The shawl, my mother's shawl, the only precious thing I had owned, the only piece of my history I had been able to give my son. Margaret had kept it all those years. Does he know? I asked. My voice was barely audible. Does William know who I am? The Duke shook his head. I thought it best to wait. He has endured so much change in his young life. I did not want to add to his confusion until I was certain you would stay, until I was certain you wanted to be part of his life. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to rage at this man who had made decisions about my son without consulting me, who had kept the truth hidden while I arrived at his door with another child in tow, believing William was still miles away in a vicar's cottage. But the anger would not come. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Gratitude. Relief. A profound and overwhelming sense that, for the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I was meant to be. I did not abandon him, I said. The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. I gave him to Margaret because I had no choice. I was 19 years old with no money and no prospects. His father refused to acknowledge him. I thought I was giving him a chance at a better life. The Duke crossed the room and stood before me. He was close enough that I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the silver threads in his dark hair, close enough that I could smell horses and morning air and something else, something warm and indefinable that made my heart beat faster despite everything. I know, he said softly. Margaret told me everything. About the viscount's son who seduced you and then cast you aside. About your uncle who turned you out. About the years you spent rebuilding your life, saving every penny so that you might one day reclaim your child. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. You did not abandon your son, Miss Ashford. You sacrificed everything to protect him. There is no greater act of love than that. I could not stop the tears that spilled down my cheeks. I had carried the weight of my guilt for so long, had convinced myself that I was a monster for giving away my own child, that I did not deserve his love or even his recognition. To hear someone speak of my choice with understanding rather than judgment was more than I could bear. The Duke offered me his handkerchief, a square of fine linen embroidered with his initials. I took it and pressed it to my face, trying to compose myself, acutely aware of how improper this scene would appear to anyone who might witness it. "What happens now?" I asked when I could trust my voice again. "That depends on you," the Duke replied. "You may stay here as William's governess, as we originally agreed. You may spend time with him, teach him, come to know him as he grows. And when you are ready, when you feel the time is right, you may tell him the truth about who you are." "And the other child?" I asked. "The boy I brought with me?" A shadow passed over the Duke's face. "I confess I was not expecting you to arrive with a child. I assumed you would come alone, having made arrangements for William's care. When I saw him, I was confused. I did not know who he was or why you had brought him. 'His name is also William,' I said. I found myself almost laughing at the absurdity of it. 'He is the son of the vicar's wife, who was caring for my son while I traveled here for the interview. She fell ill and could not keep him any longer. I had no one else to turn to, so I brought him with me. I was going to beg your permission to let him stay temporarily until I could find another arrangement.'" The Duke was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a softening around his eyes, but it transformed his face entirely. He looked younger, less burdened, almost handsome in a way I had not noticed before. "It seems we have 2 Williams in this house now," he said. "I suppose we shall have to find a way to tell them apart." I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. "You would let him stay? A child who is no relation to you, who has no claim on your charity." "Miss Ashford," the Duke said, "I have more rooms in this house than I know what to do with, and more money than any man could spend in 10 lifetimes. If taking in one small boy brings you peace of mind and allows you to focus on your duties here, then it is the least I can do." He paused, and his expression grew serious again. "Besides, I have learned that children are not burdens to be distributed according to convenience. They are gifts to be treasured. I will not turn away a child in need, regardless of his origins." I did not know what to say. This man, this cold and reclusive Duke whom society whispered about with fear and fascination, was nothing like the monster I had imagined. He was kind, he was generous, he was wounded in ways I was only beginning to understand. And he had found healing in the act of caring for a child who was not his own. "Thank you," I said. "It was inadequate, but it was all I could manage. Thank you, Your Grace, for everything." He nodded, a brief and formal gesture that did not quite match the warmth I had glimpsed in his eyes. "You should go to him," he said, "to your William. He is usually awake by now, taking breakfast in the nursery. The nurse will show you the way." I turned to leave, my heart so full of conflicting emotions that I thought it might burst. But at the door, I stopped and looked back at him. He had returned to the window, his silhouette dark against the brightening sky, and I saw the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. "Your Grace," I said. He turned to face me. "Why did you do this? Why did you bring my son here? Keep him safe. Bring me to him. You did not have to involve yourself in our troubles. You could have let him go to the parish, and no one would have thought less of you." The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because 3 years ago, I buried my wife and my daughter in the same grave. Because I spent 2 years drowning in grief, believing that I would never feel anything again. And because when I looked into your son's eyes and saw his courage, his resilience, his determination to survive despite everything the world had done to him, I recognized something of myself." He paused, and I saw his hands clench at his sides. "I could not save my own child, Miss Ashford, but I could save yours. And in doing so, perhaps I have saved myself as well." I left him standing there in the pale morning light, and I went to find my son. The nursery was on the east side of the house, a bright and cheerful room filled with toys and books and the gentle warmth of a well-tended fire. The nurse, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, introduced herself as Mrs. Hawkins, and led me to a small table where William sat eating his breakfast. He looked up when I entered, and once again I felt the shock of recognition. Those green eyes, that serious expression, the way he held his spoon with careful precision, determined to do everything properly. He was so much like my father, so much like me, that I wondered how anyone could look at us and not see the truth immediately. "Good morning, William," I said. I sat down across from him, acutely aware of the nurse watching us. "My name is Miss Ashford. I am going to be your new governess." He regarded me with the wariness of a child who had learned not to trust too easily. "Hello," he said. His voice was soft but clear. "Are you going to teach me things?" "I am," I replied. "I will teach you reading and writing and arithmetic. I will teach you history and geography and music. And I will teach you whatever else you wish to learn." He considered this for a moment. "Can you teach me about butterflies?" he asked. "I like butterflies. His Grace says they start as caterpillars, and then they change into something beautiful. I want to know how they do it." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I blinked them back. "Yes," I said, "I can teach you about butterflies." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned his attention to his breakfast. I watched him eat, memorizing every detail of his face, marveling at the miracle of his existence. He was here. He was safe. He was mine, even if he did not know it yet. The days that followed were the happiest I had known in 5 years. I threw myself into my duties as governess, spending every possible moment with William. We read together in the schoolroom, exploring fairy tales and adventure stories and books about natural history. We walked in the gardens, identifying flowers and collecting leaves and watching the butterflies that seemed to fascinate him so completely. We ate our meals together, just the two of us and the other William, who had adjusted to his new surroundings with the adaptability of the very young. I came to know my son in ways I had only dreamed of during those long years of separation. I learned that he was intelligent and curious, always asking questions that I struggled to answer. I learned that he was gentle with animals and protective of smaller children, that he hated the taste of turnips but loved apple tart, that he said his prayers every night before bed and always included Margaret and Thomas Byrne among those he asked God to bless. I learned that he remembered me, not as his mother. He did not know that. But he remembered the kind lady who used to visit sometimes, who brought him sweets and told him stories and always seemed sad when it was time to leave. He asked me once if I had known that lady, and I told him that I had. He asked if she would visit again, and I told him that she was very far away, but that she thought of him often. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough for now. The Duke kept his distance during those early weeks. I saw him occasionally at meals when he would join us in the dining room and make polite conversation before retreating to his study. I saw him sometimes in the gardens, walking alone with his head bowed, lost in thoughts I could not fathom. He was unfailingly courteous to me, unfailingly kind to both Williams, but there was a wall around him that I did not know how to breach. And yet, despite his remoteness, I found myself thinking of him more than I should. I thought of the way he had spoken about his wife and daughter, the raw grief that had colored every word. I thought of the generosity that had led him to take in a stranger's child, to bring that child's mother into his home, to offer salvation to people who had no claim on his compassion. I thought of his gray eyes and his rare smiles and the way my heart beat faster whenever he entered a room. It was dangerous, I knew. He was a duke, and I was a governess. The distance between us was vast and uncrossable, measured not only in wealth and title, but in the fundamental structures of a society that would never accept such a match. I had already learned the cost of loving above my station. I had no intention of making that mistake again. But the heart does not listen to reason. The heart sees what it wants and reaches for it with both hands, regardless of the consequences. And my heart, battered and scarred though it was, had begun to reach for Edmund Blackwood, in ways I could not control. I did not know then that my past was about to catch up with me. I did not know that Charles Whitmore, the man who had destroyed my life and abandoned his own child, was about to re-enter my world with consequences I could never have predicted. I did not know that the peace I had found at Ashworth Hall was about to be shattered forever. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a messenger in the distinctive livery of a London household. I was in the schoolroom with both Williams when the butler appeared at the door, his expression carefully neutral as he informed me that His Grace requested my presence in the drawing room. There were visitors, he said, important visitors from London. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. In the 6 weeks since my arrival at Ashworth Hall, we had received no visitors. The Duke's reputation for reclusiveness was well established, and the local gentry had long since stopped attempting to call. For someone to have travelled from London, for the Duke to have admitted them, something significant must have occurred. I left the children in the care of Mrs. Hawkins and made my way downstairs, smoothing my dress and checking my hair in the mirror that hung in the hallway. I did not know what awaited me, but I wanted to face it with dignity. The drawing room was a grand space I had rarely entered, all velvet curtains and gilded frames and furniture that spoke of generations of wealth. The Duke stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid with tension, and across from him sat a woman I did not recognize. She was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in the height of London fashion, with sharp eyes that assessed me the moment I crossed the threshold. "Ah," the Duke said, and there was something in his voice I had not heard before. A warning, perhaps, or an apology. "Miss Ashford. Allow me to introduce Lady Pemberton. She is an old friend of my late wife's family." Lady Pemberton inclined her head, but her eyes never left my face. "So this is the governess," she said. Her tone made it clear that the word was not a compliment. "I must say, Edmund, I expected someone older, someone less attractive." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Eleanor Ashford is an excellent governess," he replied. "Her appearance is irrelevant to her qualifications." "Is it?" Lady Pemberton smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "I wonder what society will say when they learn that the reclusive Duke of Ashworth has installed a beautiful young woman in his household. A woman with no references, no family connections, and a mysterious past that no one seems willing to discuss." I felt the blood drain from my face. I did not know this woman, had never seen her before in my life, but she clearly knew something about me. Something that could destroy everything I had built. "What do you want, Helena?" the Duke asked. His voice was cold now, the voice of a man who had long since lost patience with social games. Lady Pemberton rose from her seat and crossed to where I stood frozen by the door. She circled me slowly, examining me as one might examine a horse before purchase, and I forced myself to stand still under her scrutiny. "I want nothing," she said. "I am merely the bearer of news. It seems that your little governess has attracted the attention of someone rather important. Someone who recognized her name when it appeared in the household registry that my husband obtained through his connections at the Home Office." She paused, savoring the moment, and I knew with terrible certainty what she was about to say. "Charles Whitmore, Viscount Ashby, sends his regards." Lady Pemberton continued. "He was most surprised to learn that his former paramour had found employment with a duke. He was even more surprised to learn that she had done so under her real name, as though she had nothing to hide." She turned to the Duke, her expression triumphant. "Did you know, Edmund, that Miss Ashford bore the Viscount a child out of wedlock? Did you know that she is a fallen woman, a disgrace to her family, a creature unfit to educate the children of decent people?" The silence that followed was absolute. I could not move, could not speak, could barely breathe. Everything I had feared, everything I had worked so hard to escape, had found me at last. And then the Duke did something I did not expect. He laughed. It was not a joyful sound. It was hard and bitter, the laugh of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be surprised by any of it. He moved to stand beside me, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his authority. "I know exactly who Miss Ashford is," he said. "I know her history, her circumstances, and the nature of her relationship with Charles Whitmore. I also know that Whitmore seduced her with false promises, abandoned her when she became inconvenient, and has spent the last 5 years destroying the reputations of anyone who dares to mention his own dishonorable conduct." He paused, and his gray eyes were like steel. "If you have come here to threaten Miss Ashford on his behalf, you may tell him that his threats mean nothing to me. She is under my protection now, and I will not tolerate any attempt to harm her." Lady Pemberton's composure faltered. She had not expected this. She had expected the Duke to be horrified, to dismiss me immediately, to thank her for exposing the serpent in his household. Instead, he had placed himself between me and danger, had claimed me as his own responsibility. "You cannot be serious," she said. "Edmund, think of your reputation. Think of what people will say when they learn you are harboring this woman under your roof." "I care nothing for what people say," the Duke replied. "I have not cared for 3 years, and I do not intend to start now. You may return to London and tell your friends whatever you wish. You may tell Charles Whitmore that if he attempts to contact Miss Ashford or interfere with her life in any way, he will answer to me personally. And you may tell society that the Duke of Ashworth sends his regards and wishes to be left in peace." He rang the bell, and the butler appeared with remarkable speed. "Lady Pemberton's carriage is leaving," the Duke said. "Please see her out." Lady Pemberton gathered her dignity around her like a cloak. "You will regret this, Edmund," she said. "You cannot hide forever. Sooner or later, you will have to rejoin the world, and when you do, this scandal will follow you everywhere." "Then I shall remain hidden," the Duke replied. "It suits me well enough." He did not watch her leave. Instead, he turned to me, and I saw concern in his eyes where I had expected anger or disappointment. "Are you all right?" he asked. I was not all right. I was trembling so violently that I could barely stand. The carefully constructed walls of my new life had been breached, and I did not know how to repair them. Charles knew where I was. Charles knew I was here in this house with his son just 2 floors above us. If he decided to pursue the matter, if he decided to claim William or expose me further, there was nothing I could do to stop him. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why would you defend me?" "You barely know me. My past could bring scandal upon your house, upon your name. Why would you risk that for someone like me?" The Duke was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "Because I have seen enough injustice in this world," he said finally. "Because Charles Whitmore is a coward and a villain who deserves to face consequences for his actions. And because you, Miss Ashford, have shown more courage and integrity in the face of adversity than most people display in a lifetime of comfort." He paused, and something softened in his expression. "You gave up everything to protect your child. You rebuilt your life from nothing. You came to this house prepared to work for your son's future, never knowing that he was already here. That is not the behavior of a fallen woman. That is the behavior of a hero." I could not stop the tears that spilled down my cheeks. No one had ever spoken to me like this. No one had ever seen my choices as anything other than shameful. To hear this man, this Duke, call me a hero was more than I could comprehend. He offered me his handkerchief again, and this time, when I took it, our fingers touched. It was the briefest contact, lasting no more than a heartbeat, but I felt it like lightning through my body. I looked up at him, and I saw something in his gray eyes that took my breath away, something that looked remarkably like the beginning of love. The weeks that followed were tense with anticipation. I waited for Charles to make his move, to appear at our door demanding access to his son, to launch some campaign of social destruction that would drive me from Ashworth Hall. But nothing happened. The days passed in their quiet routine, lessons and meals and walks in the garden, and gradually I began to believe that perhaps Lady Pemberton's visit had been an empty threat. I was wrong. The invitation arrived in early autumn, delivered by a messenger who bore the seal of the Earl of Hartington. The Earl was hosting a ball at his estate, just 20 miles from Ashworth Hall, and the Duke of Ashworth was cordially requested to attend. It was, according to the accompanying note, a gathering of old friends who wished to welcome him back to society after his years of mourning. The Duke showed me the invitation with a grim expression. "It is a trap," he said. "Hartington is Whitmore's uncle by marriage. This ball is nothing more than an excuse to parade you before society and expose our arrangement to public scrutiny." "Then we will not attend," I said. "Let them whisper about us from a distance. It is better than confronting them directly." But the Duke shook his head. "If we do not attend, they will say we are hiding. They will say that we have something to be ashamed of. The rumors will grow wilder with each passing day, and eventually they will reach a point where even my protection cannot shield you." He met my eyes, and I saw the determination there. We must go. We must face them together and show them that we will not be intimidated. Together. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "I am a governess. I cannot attend a ball with you. It would be inappropriate. It would confirm every suspicion they have about the nature of our relationship." The Duke smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days. "Then we shall give them something else to talk about," he said. He reached into his desk and withdrew a document which he handed to me. "I had my solicitor draw this up last week. It establishes you as my ward, a distant cousin who fell on hard times and whom I have taken under my protection. It gives you a place in society, a legitimate reason to be in my household, and a shield against the accusations they wish to level against you." I stared at the document, my hands shaking. He had done this for me. Without asking, without expecting anything in return, he had given me a new identity, a new life, a chance to stand beside him as something other than a servant. "Why?" I asked again. It seemed to be the only question I was capable of asking anymore. "Because you deserve it," he replied. "And because I find that I cannot bear the thought of losing you." He left me standing there with the document in my hands and my heart in chaos. I did not know what to make of his confession. I did not know if he meant what I thought he meant, or if I was simply reading my own feelings into his words. I knew only that something had shifted between us, something that could not be undone. The night of the ball arrived with all the terrible inevitability of a storm on the horizon. I dressed in a gown the Duke had procured for me, a confection of deep green silk that brought out the color of my eyes. A maid arranged my hair in an elaborate style I had not worn since my days in my uncle's house, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman who stared back. The Duke was waiting for me at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed in formal evening attire, all black and white and severe elegance, and when he saw me descending toward him, something flickered in his eyes that made my breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply. I did not know how to respond. I had been called beautiful before by a man who used the word as a weapon. Coming from the Duke, it felt like something else entirely, like a gift, like a promise. The carriage ride to Hartington's estate passed in near silence. I sat across from the Duke, watching the moonlit countryside roll past the window, trying to prepare myself for what lay ahead. I knew Charles would be there. I knew he would try to humiliate me. I did not know if I would have the strength to endure it. When we arrived, the ballroom was already crowded with London's elite. I felt their eyes on me the moment we entered, felt the whispers that rippled through the room like wind through wheat. The Duke offered me his arm, and I took it, grateful for his solid presence beside me. We had barely made it 10 steps into the room when I saw him. Charles Whitmore stood near the refreshment table, a glass of champagne in his hand and a sneer on his handsome face. He was older than I remembered, his blonde hair beginning to thin at the temples, his features coarsened by years of indulgence. Beside him stood a woman I recognized from Lady Pemberton's description as his wife, Lady Sophia, a thin and unhappy creature who looked as though she had not smiled in years. Charles saw me at the same moment I saw him. His eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with malicious pleasure. He said something to his wife, who nodded without interest, and then he began to make his way across the room toward us. The Duke's hand tightened on my arm. "Steady," he murmured. "Do not let him see your fear." I raised my chin and met Charles's gaze without flinching. I was not the naive girl he had seduced and abandoned 5 years ago. I was a woman who had survived hell and emerged stronger for it. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me cower. "Well, well," Charles said as he reached us. His voice carried across the nearby conversations, deliberately loud enough to attract attention. "If it is not my old friend Eleanor, and in such elevated company." He turned to the Duke with a mocking bow. "Your Grace, I see the rumors are true. You have taken quite an interest in fallen women." The Duke's expression did not change. "Whitmore," he said. His voice was ice. "I would say it is a pleasure, but I was raised not to lie." Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Still hiding away in your country estate, I see. Still mourning that wife of yours. Tell me, have you managed to produce an heir yet? Or are you still wallowing in your grief?" I felt the Duke stiffen beside me, felt the pain that Charles's words inflicted on him, and something inside me snapped. I had endured Charles's cruelty in silence for 5 years. I had let him destroy my reputation, my prospects, my very sense of self. But I would not let him hurt this man who had shown me nothing but kindness. "That is enough," I said. My voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the murmur of nearby conversations. "You have no right to speak to His Grace in such a manner." Charles turned to me, his eyes glittering with amusement. "No right? My dear Eleanor, I have every right. I am a viscount. He is a duke who has forgotten his place in society, and you are nothing but a whore who somehow managed to find a new protector." The word hit me like a slap, but I did not flinch. I thought of my son, safe in his bed at Ashworth Hall. I thought of the courage he had shown in the face of so much loss, and I found courage of my own. "I am many things," I said quietly. "I am a mother. I am a governess. I am a woman who has worked harder than you could ever imagine to build a life from the ashes of the one you destroyed. But I am not a whore, and I am not afraid of you. Not anymore." The room had gone silent around us. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Charles's face had flushed an ugly red, his composure cracking for the first time. "You forget yourself," he hissed. "You forget who I am and what I can do to you." "No," the Duke said, stepping forward until he stood directly in front of Charles. "You forget yourself. You forget that you are speaking to a lady under my protection. And you forget that I am not the kind of man who tolerates insults to those I care about." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. "Leave. Now. Before I forget that I am a gentleman and give you the thrashing you so richly deserve." Charles stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of impotent rage. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd toward the door. I watched him go, and I felt something release inside my chest. A knot of fear and shame that I had carried for 5 years finally began to loosen. The Duke turned to me, and in his gray eyes I saw something I had never dared to hope for: pride, admiration, and something deeper, something that made my heart soar. "Shall we dance?" he asked, offering me his hand. I took it, and together we stepped onto the floor. The dance changed everything. I do not know how to explain it, except to say that when the Duke took me in his arms and we began to move across the floor, something shifted in the universe. The whispers around us faded to nothing. The watching eyes ceased to matter. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand on my waist, and the gray depths of his eyes holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. We did not speak. We did not need to. Everything that had been building between us over the past weeks found expression in that dance, in the way our bodies moved together as though we had been partners for years, in the way his fingers tightened on mine during the turns, in the way he looked at me as though I were the only woman in the room. When the music ended, we stood together in the center of the floor, reluctant to break apart. The other guests had begun to murmur again, their voices rising in speculation and scandal, but I could not bring myself to care. Let them talk. Let them condemn us. In that moment, I felt more alive than I had in years. The Duke escorted me from the floor, his hand still warm on the small of my back. "We should leave," he said quietly. "We have made our point. There is no need to endure further scrutiny." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. The confrontation with Charles had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. I needed to be away from these people, away from their judgment and their cruelty. I needed to return to Ashworth Hall, where my son was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battles being fought on his behalf. The carriage ride home was different from the journey there. Where before we had sat in tense silence, now there was a new quality to the quiet between us. An awareness, an anticipation. I could feel the Duke's gaze on me in the darkness, could sense the questions he wanted to ask, the words he wanted to say. It was he who finally broke the silence. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, "the way you stood up to Whitmore, the way you refused to let him diminish you. I have never seen anything like it." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, grateful that the darkness hid my reaction. I was terrified, I admitted. I thought I might faint. "But you did not," he replied. "You found your courage when it mattered most. That is the mark of true strength." I turned to look at him, trying to read his expression in the shifting moonlight. "Your Grace," I said carefully. "What happened tonight at the ball, the way you defended me, the way you claimed me before all of society, there will be consequences. People will talk. Your reputation will suffer." "Let them talk," he said, echoing my own thoughts from earlier. "I have spent 3 years hiding from the world, nursing my grief like a wounded animal in its den. I told myself it was because I could not bear the memories, could not face the places where Catherine and I had been happy together. But the truth is that I was afraid of feeling anything again, afraid of caring about someone and losing them as I lost her." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "And then you came to my house with your green eyes and your quiet courage, and you brought my life back to me. You and William, both of you, have given me a reason to emerge from the shadows. I will not let society's disapproval take that from me." My heart was pounding so loudly, I was certain he could hear it. "Your Grace," I whispered. "Edmund," he said. "When we are alone, I would like you to call me Edmund." Edmund. I tested the name on my tongue, feeling its weight, its intimacy. "And you must call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," he repeated, and the way he said it made my name sound like poetry. We arrived at Ashworth Hall just as the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky. The house was quiet, the servants not yet stirring, and we entered through a side door to avoid disturbing anyone. In the entrance hall we paused, neither of us quite ready to part. "I should check on William," I said. "Make sure he is sleeping well." "Of course," Edmund replied. He took my hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to my gloved fingers. "Sleep well, Eleanor. We will speak more tomorrow." I floated up the stairs to the nursery, my heart so full of joy that I thought it might overflow. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if what was growing between us could survive the obstacles that stood in our path. But in that moment, I allowed myself to hope. William was sleeping peacefully in his small bed, one hand curled beneath his cheek, the other clutching a wooden horse that Edmund had given him. I stood in the doorway watching him breathe, marveling at the miracle of his existence, and I made a silent promise. I would tell him the truth. Soon. I would find the right words to explain who I was, who he was, and why I had made the choices I had made. He deserved to know that he was loved, that he had always been loved, even when circumstances had forced us apart. The other William was sleeping in the next room, equally peaceful, equally precious. In the weeks since our arrival, the two boys had become inseparable friends, despite the difference in their ages. They played together, learned together, and had developed their own private language of jokes and games that no adult could decipher. It gave me comfort to know that whatever happened, my son would have a friend, a brother in spirit, if not in blood. The days that followed the ball were quiet ones. Edmund and I did not speak directly of what had passed between us, but there was a new ease in our interactions, a warmth that had not been there before. We took our meals together more often. We walked in the gardens while the boys played nearby. We sat in his study in the evenings, reading by the fire, comfortable in each other's silence. I began to believe that perhaps happiness was possible after all. But Charles Whitmore had not forgotten his humiliation, and he was not the kind of man to let such a slight go unanswered. The letter arrived 3 weeks after the ball, delivered by a solicitor's clerk who wore the smug expression of a man who knows he is delivering bad news. Edmund received him in his study, and when he emerged an hour later, his face was pale with rage. "He is suing for custody," Edmund said without preamble. He handed me the letter, and I read it with growing horror. Whitmore is claiming that William is his legitimate son, born of a secret marriage that he now wishes to acknowledge. He is demanding that the boy be returned to him immediately. I could not breathe. The words on the page blurred before my eyes, their meaning too terrible to comprehend. A secret marriage? There had been no marriage. Charles had never so much as hinted at the possibility. He had made it abundantly clear that a woman of my station could never be his wife, that his heir must come from a union that would enhance his position in society. "This is a lie," I said. "We were never married. He abandoned me." He refused to acknowledge William. How can he claim the boy now, after 5 years of silence? "Because he has no other heir," Edmund replied grimly. "His wife has failed to produce a child, and the doctors have told him she never will. Without a son, his title and estates will pass to a distant cousin he despises. He needs William, not because he cares about the boy, but because the boy is his only hope of preserving his legacy." I felt the room spin around me. All this time, I had feared that Charles would expose my shame to the world. I had never imagined that he would try to take my son. "He cannot win," I said, though I was not certain I believed it. "There is no proof of a marriage. I can testify that we were never wed." Edmund shook his head. "In cases like this, a man's word carries more weight than a woman's, especially a woman with your history. Whitmore will claim that you are lying to protect yourself, that you destroyed the evidence of your marriage out of spite when he failed to meet your expectations. He will paint himself as the wronged husband, the devoted father who has been kept from his son by a vindictive woman." "Then what can we do?" I asked. My voice broke on the words. "I cannot lose him, Edmund. Not again. Not after everything we have been through." Edmund crossed the room and took my hands in his. His grip was firm and warm, an anchor in the storm that threatened to consume me. "We will fight," he said. "We will hire the best solicitors in England. We will present evidence of Whitmore's abandonment, his years of silence, his failure to provide for his own child. And we will reveal the truth about his character, the cruelty and selfishness that hide behind his charming facade." "And if that is not enough?" I whispered. "Then we will find another way," he replied. "I will not let him take William. I swear it on my life." The weeks that followed were a nightmare of legal proceedings and anxious waiting. Edmund was true to his word. engaging the finest legal minds in London to build our case. We gathered evidence of Charles's abandonment, statements from Margaret Burns' neighbors who remembered how he had refused to acknowledge the child, financial records showing that he had never provided a penny for William's care. We built a wall of truth around our boy, and we prayed it would be enough. But Charles had resources of his own. He had connections, influence, and a willingness to lie that knew no bounds. He produced witnesses who claimed to have attended our wedding, a ceremony that had supposedly taken place in a small village church that had since burned to the ground. He produced letters that he claimed I had written, letters that spoke of our marriage and my anger at his abandonment. The letters were forgeries, I knew, but they were convincing ones. The case went before a judge in late November. I sat in the courtroom with Edmund beside me, watching as lawyers argued about the fate of my child. Charles was there, dressed in his finest clothes, playing the role of the wronged father with consummate skill. He spoke of his love for his son, his desperate desire to reclaim the boy who had been stolen from him. He wept actual tears when he described the anguish of separation. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to stand up and tell the entire courtroom what kind of man he really was. But Edmund had warned me to remain silent, to let our solicitors do their work, to trust in the strength of our case. And then something unexpected happened. The doors of the courtroom opened, and Lady Sophia Whitmore walked in. She was pale and thin, even more so than when I had seen her at the ball, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. She walked with the deliberate care of someone who has made a difficult decision and is determined to see it through. "I wish to make a statement," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I wish to tell the truth about my husband." Charles's face went white. "Sophia," he hissed, "what are you doing? Sit down." But she did not sit down. She stood before the judge and began to speak, and what she revealed changed everything. She told of the letters Charles had forged, how she had watched him practice my handwriting night after night until he could replicate it perfectly. She told of the witnesses he had bribed, men who had never set foot in the village where our supposed wedding had taken place. She told of the real reason he wanted William, not out of love, but out of desperation to secure his inheritance. And she told of the years of cruelty she had endured as his wife, the verbal abuse, the public humiliations, the constant reminders that she had failed in her one duty to provide him with an heir. She told of how she had lost 3 pregnancies in 4 years of marriage, each loss followed by Charles's contempt rather than his comfort. She told of how he had blamed her for her barren womb, had threatened to have their marriage annulled, had made her life a prison of shame and fear. "I do not know Eleanor Ashford," Lady Sophia concluded. "I do not know if she is a good woman or a bad one. But I know my husband. I know what he is capable of, and I know that any child would be better off far away from him." The courtroom erupted. Charles was on his feet, shouting denials, demanding that his wife be removed. The judge called for order, his gavel pounding against the bench. And through it all, Lady Sophia stood calm and still, her eyes meeting mine with an expression of weary solidarity. She had destroyed her own life to save my son. She had sacrificed her marriage, her reputation, her place in society, all to ensure that a child she had never met would not fall into the hands of a monster. I wept. I could not help it. The tears streamed down my face as the judge called a recess, as Edmund gathered me in his arms and held me while I sobbed. It was over. Charles's case had collapsed. The forgeries had been exposed, the witnesses discredited. No judge would grant him custody now. When we emerged from the courthouse, the November air was crisp and cold, but I felt nothing but warmth. Edmund stood beside me, his arm around my waist, and I leaned into him without shame. "It is finished," he said. "William is safe." "Yes," I replied, "but there is still one thing I must do." He looked at me questioningly, and I smiled through my tears. "I have to tell him the truth," I said. I have to tell my son who I really am. I waited 3 days before I found the courage to speak to William. 3 days of watching him play in the nursery, of reading him stories before bed, of memorizing every expression that crossed his small face. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was that I was terrified. I had imagined this conversation 1,000 times over the past 5 years, and in every version I had failed to find the words that could make him understand. It was Edmund who finally gave me the push I needed. We were sitting in his study on a December evening, the fire crackling in the hearth and snow falling softly outside the windows. The boys were asleep upstairs, and the house had settled into that particular stillness that comes with winter nights. "You cannot keep postponing this," he said gently. "The longer you wait, the harder it will become." "I know," I replied. "But what if he hates me? What if he cannot forgive me for giving him away?" Edmund set down his book and crossed the room to sit beside me. He took my hands in his, a gesture that had become familiar between us, a source of comfort that I had come to depend upon. "Children have a remarkable capacity for love," he said. "They do not see the world through the lens of judgment that adults have learned to apply. William knows you. He has spent months in your company, learning from you, trusting you. Whatever you tell him, he will hear it through that trust." "And if trust is not enough," I whispered. "Then we will help him understand," Edmund replied. "We will answer his questions, give him time to adjust, and love him through whatever confusion he feels. He is not alone in this, Eleanor. Neither are you." I looked at him, this man who had entered my life as an employer and become so much more. In the weeks since the trial, something had shifted between us. The barriers we had maintained, the careful distance dictated by propriety and circumstance, had begun to crumble. We had not spoken of it directly, had not named the feeling that grew stronger with each passing day. But it was there, present in every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of shared silence. "Edmund," I said, "there is something I must ask you. About William and about us." He waited, his gray eyes patient, his hands warm around mine. "If I tell William the truth," I continued, "if I reclaim my place as his mother, what happens then? I am still a governess in your household. I am still a woman without fortune or family. The scandal of my past has not disappeared simply because we won a legal battle. And William, he has lived these past months as your ward, under your protection. What becomes of him? What becomes of me?" Edmund was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious. "I have been thinking about that very question," he said. "I have been thinking about it since the night of the ball, when I held you in my arms and realized that I did not want to let you go." He paused, and I saw him gather his courage. "Eleanor, I know that my position complicates matters. I know that any declaration I make could be seen as an abuse of power, an exploitation of your dependence upon me. That is why I have waited, why I have held my tongue even when every part of me wanted to speak." He released my hands and rose from his seat, pacing to the window where the snow continued to fall in silent curtains. "But I cannot remain silent forever," he continued. "I cannot pretend that what I feel for you is merely friendship or concern." He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw the same vulnerability I had glimpsed on that first morning in his study. "I love you, Eleanor. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you look at the world with hope, despite everything it has done to you. I love watching you with William, seeing the bond between you grow stronger each day. I love the way you challenge me, the way you refuse to let me retreat into my grief." He took a breath. "I want you to stay. Not as a governess, not as a ward, but as my wife. If you will have me." The world stopped. The fire ceased to crackle, the snow ceased to fall, and there was nothing but Edmund standing before me, his heart in his hands, waiting for my answer. I rose from my seat and crossed the room to where he stood. I looked up into his face, This face that had become so dear to me, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble. "I thought I would never love again," I said. After Charles, after everything that happened, I believed that part of me had died. I believed I was destined to spend my life alone, watching happiness from a distance, never daring to reach for it myself. I paused, feeling tears gather in my eyes. But you changed that. You showed me that kindness still exists, that there are men in this world who see women as more than objects to be used and discarded. You gave my son a home when he had none. You gave me a chance when anyone else would have turned me away. How could I not love you?" Edmund's hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that spilled down my cheeks. "Is that a yes?" he asked, and there was wonder in his voice. "Yes," I said. 1,000 times, yes." He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the kisses I remembered from my youth. There was no deception in it, no hidden agenda, no promise that would later be broken. There was only tenderness and truth, and the beginning of something that would last a lifetime. I told William the next morning. We sat together in the nursery, just the two of us, while the other William played with Mrs. Hawkins in the adjoining room. The winter sun streamed through the windows, casting patterns of light across the floor, and my son looked up at me with those green eyes that were so like my own. "I have something important to tell you," I said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." He waited, patient and attentive, the way he always was when he sensed that something serious was happening. "Do you remember the kind lady who used to visit you when you lived with Margaret and Thomas?" I asked. "The one who brought you sweets and told you stories?" He nodded. "You said she was far away." "I did say that," I agreed, "but it was not quite true. The kind lady is not far away at all. She is right here, sitting in front of you." I took a breath, feeling my heart pound against my ribs. "William, I am that lady, and I am something else too, something I have wanted to tell you for a very long time. I am your mother." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. William stared at me, his small face working through emotions I could not read. I saw confusion there, and surprise, and something that might have been hurt. I braced myself for anger, for rejection, for the questions I had dreaded for 5 years. But instead, he asked only one thing. "Why did you go away?" I felt my heart break and mend itself in the same instant. I pulled him onto my lap, holding him close, breathing in the scent of his hair. "Because I was very young," I said, "and I had no money and no way to take care of you properly. I wanted to give you a better life than I could provide. So I gave you to Margaret and Thomas, who loved you very much, and I promised myself that one day, when I could give you the life you deserved, I would come back for you. But you are here now," he said. "Does that mean you came back?" "Yes," I said. "I came back. And I am never going to leave you again." He was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness that characterized everything he did. Then he looked up at me, with an expression that made my tears fall faster. "Can I call you Mother?" he asked. I could not speak. I could only nod and hold him tighter, feeling the last of the walls I had built around my heart crumble into dust. We sat like that for a long time, mother and son, finally reunited in truth as well as in fact. When we finally separated, William had more questions. Questions about his father, and about why I had chosen Margaret and Thomas, and about whether the Duke knew I was his mother. I answered as honestly as I could, shaping the truth in ways a 5-year-old child could understand, leaving out the cruelty and focusing on the love that had guided every decision I had made. His Grace knew, I told him. He brought me here so that I could be with you. He has been taking care of both of us. William considered this. "Does that mean he is going to be my father now?" he asked. I smiled, remembering Edmund's proposal from the night before. "Would you like that?" I asked. William nodded without hesitation. "He is kind," he said. He teaches me about horses and lets me sit in his study when he works. He does not get angry when I ask too many questions. He paused, then added with childlike simplicity, "I think he would be a good father." "I think so too," I agreed. The wedding took place in spring, when the gardens of Ashworth Hall were bursting with new life. It was a small ceremony, attended only by those who mattered most. The vicar from the village performed the service. Mrs. Hawkins and the household staff stood witness, and both Williams, my son and the other boy who had become like a son to me, served as ring-bearers, their small faces solemn with the importance of their duty. I wore a gown of pale blue silk, the color of a spring sky, and carried flowers from the garden where I had first seen my son chasing butterflies. Edmund stood at the altar in his finest clothes, but it was his eyes that I noticed most, the way they lit up when I walked toward him, the way they promised a future I had never dared to imagine. We spoke our vows in clear voices, pledging ourselves to each other before God and before the people we loved. When Edmund slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt the weight of it settle not as a chain, but as an anchor, a foundation upon which to build a new life, the Duchess of Ashworth. That was my title now, a title I had never sought, never expected, never believed I could deserve. But Edmund had shown me that worth was not determined by birth or fortune. It was determined by the choices we made, the love we gave, and the courage we found in the face of adversity. Charles Whitmore did not trouble us again. The scandal of Lady Sophia's testimony had destroyed his reputation in society. His wife had left him, returning to her family with what remained of her fortune and her dignity. The last I heard, he had retreated to a small property in the country, shunned by the very society he had worked so hard to impress. I could not find it in my heart to pity him. He had made his choices, and he was living with the consequences. Lady Sophia sent me a letter after the wedding, a brief note congratulating me on my marriage and expressing hope for my happiness. I wrote back, thanking her for her courage in the courtroom, for the sacrifice she had made on behalf of a child she did not know. We have corresponded occasionally since then. She has found a measure of peace in her new life, and I am glad for her. We are bound together by our shared experience of Charles's cruelty, two women who survived and emerged stronger for it. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. I watched my son grow from a serious little boy into a thoughtful young man, watched him learn and explore and become everything I had dreamed he could be. Edmund adopted him formally, giving him the Blackwood name and making him heir to the dukedom. William accepted this with the same quiet grace he brought to everything, understanding that family was not a matter of blood alone. The other William remained with us as well. Edmund and I adopted him too, giving him a home and a future that his birth parents could never have provided. The two boys grew up as brothers, their bond unbreakable, their friendship a source of joy for everyone who witnessed it. Edmund and I were blessed with two more children in the years that followed. A daughter we named Catherine, after his first wife, and a son we named Thomas, after the man who had helped raise my firstborn when I could not. Our family grew and thrived within the walls of Ashworth Hall, filling the house with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of childhood. I think often of the girl I was at 19, alone and frightened, facing a future that seemed to hold nothing but darkness. I think of the choices I made, the sacrifices that seemed so devastating at the time, and I understand now that they were leading me here. Every tear I shed, every night I spent aching for my son, every moment of despair that threatened to consume me, all of it was part of a journey I could not see until I reached its end. Life does not always give us what we expect. It gives us what we need, if we are brave enough to accept it. I found my son. I found my love. I found a family that accepts me for who I am, not who society says I should be. And I found something else too, something I had lost in that garden 5 years ago when a charming viscount broke my heart. I found myself. The past will always be part of me. The scars it left will never fully fade. But they are reminders now, not wounds. Reminders of how far I have come, how much I have survived, how strong I was even when I felt weakest. If you are reading this, if you are somewhere in the darkness I once knew, let me offer you this truth. Hope exists, even when you cannot see it. Love exists, even when you have been taught to fear it. And second chances exist, even when you believe you do not deserve them. I am Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth. I am a mother, a wife, a survivor. And this is my story, written so that someday, when my children are old enough to understand, they will know the truth of how our family came to be. They will know that their mother was once a frightened girl who made an impossible choice out of love. They will know that their father was a grieving man who found healing and compassion. And they will know that the bonds that hold us together were forged not in the easy times, but in the fire of our greatest trials. That is the legacy I wish to leave them. Not wealth or title, though they will have both. But the knowledge that love, true love, can survive anything. Even the darkest nights end in dawn. I am living proof of that. And so, as I sit in the garden where this story began, watching my children play among the roses while my husband reads beside me, I allow myself to feel something I denied myself for so many years. I allow myself to feel happy, truly, completely, impossibly happy. And I know, with the certainty that comes from having walked through fire and emerged whole, that this happiness is not borrowed or temporary. It is mine, it is ours, it is forever.